So, switch of camera angle as you can see, and that is because as I got to the top, or Yosemite Point that is, my camera started making a really loud whirring sound, and while it could kind of operate, like the autofocus wouldn't work, I didn't feel comfortable using it for extended periods of time, so kind of had to just get what I could and go. And then it started snowing, and I think it probably started not working because of the snow and the cold. So yeah, I had to switch up, but I think it's okay. I got pretty much everything else. Pretty much the whole hike is done. Now I'm just coming back down, so it's not all bad. So after my Sony a7 II sort of died on me at the top of Yosemite Point, I realized that the next time I went on a big photography-focused trip like this, I'd probably want something else. And that meant that probably within the next year or so, I'd want a new camera body to replace this one. And once I started thinking about it that way, I realized it's probably not a great idea to wait, honestly, to get a new body. Because to me, when you start getting gear specifically for a trip, it skews your perception of what you really need out of your camera. And I also really don't want to be fumbling with new gear while I'm somewhere far from home. But this sparks a new thought in my head of, well, you don't really need to upgrade. You can actually just use this camera until it completely dies, or you can just buy a new Sony a7 II and skip all the features of the newer models. And this brought me all the way back to a classic photography question: does gear really matter? And I honestly think this is a pretty shitty question, so I want to go on the record right off the rip and say, yes, gear 100% matters. If you're trying to take classic street style images on a 70-200, you're going to have a pretty hard time. And if you take all your portraits with a 16mm fisheye or something, those are going to look kind of funny. The essence of the does gear matter question is really just to say that you can be an excellent photographer despite the limitations of your gear. You can take really amazing landscape photos without a medium format camera, and you can take classy looking portraits without the absolute sharpest lens. But nonetheless, this question lived rent-free in my head for a couple weeks. Well, my Sony a7 II works about 90% of the time, and it shoots 1080p at 60 FPS, so that's really all I need. After a while though, I realized, hey, I'm trying to do this photography thing professionally. I've been at it for a few years now, I'm not completely broke, and honestly, I can see this as an investment in my future. So that's ultimately how I framed it. Now, I don't recommend this for everyone, of course, but I do feel like I purchased this Sony a7 II 4 years ago, and I've achieved so much with it, and it was so much of a bolder purchase back then. When I bought this camera, I was a sophomore in college with about $1,300 in my bank account, and after I bought this Sony and the lens, I was sitting about $200 in my bank account. So I really went all out on this, and I feel like I've gained so much from it. And I've grown so much with this camera to the point where now I can see exactly the faults and limitations that this camera has. So after a very long and hard mental battle with myself, I've decided that, you know what, I can pull the trigger on a pretty large financial decision, so here is the new camera setup that I bought. So, I bought this. This is the Sony a7 IV with a Sony 24mm 2.8. Now when I got this, I actually originally had the Sony 35mm 2.8, the Zeiss one, but didn't like it that much. When I compared it to this, the 16-35, it's actually a little bit tighter, and from what I read online, was more like a 37mm lens than a 35. And I was already kind of taking a leap with the 35 because I thought that'd be too tight, but it was significantly smaller than this 24mm. So I tried that out, but it didn't quite work out. So I returned the 35mm and got this 24mm instead, but we'll get back to that in just a second. First, I want to talk about the body. Now, it became a little more obvious to me that I should be getting a new camera when I was doing research comparing this to the Sony a7 II, because this is a better camera in just about every single way. More dynamic range, more megapixels, better ISO performance, on and on. The list just does not stop. If you go on cameradecision.com and compare them, there's like 3 upsides to the Sony a7 II, none of which were really relevant to me. It's pretty easy to understand why a camera sold in 2014 versus a camera in 2021 would have a pretty big performance gap. So I'm not going to bore you with all those details. I'm just going to focus on the 3 aspects about this camera that I really appreciate. Number 1 is the autofocus. I don't know how this video is going to turn out, but the autofocus with the Sony a7 II has been so rough for me. So rough. I swear, all the time I'll be recording videos, I'll be focusing my face, and then all of a sudden it just goes to the back. Just goes way to infinity almost, and it just sits there, and I have no idea what I could do about it. I would just have to redo the take, and honestly, I would say 95% of the content that you see on my channel prior to this has been filmed with manual focus, which is not a good thing because I'm moving dynamically, I'm coming in back and forth, so manual focus wasn't perfect there, but it was better than autofocus because the autofocus would just go all the way into oblivion and there was nothing I could do about it. That was a whole rant. I just laid into the Sony a7 II. Next up is battery life, and let me grab one of these batteries real quick. Alright, so you can, autofocus, please. So this is a battery for the Sony a7 II, and this is a battery for the Sony a7 IV. Obviously, pretty significant size difference. This one lasts way, way longer. I have used this camera setup for days, just taking photos, leave it at 60 whatever percent, and then come back the next day. Like 24 hours later, it's still like 60 whatever percent. These just drain passively over time so much more. And I will admit that the batteries that came with the Sony a7 II kit that I bought way back when, these are not like Sony manufactured batteries, these are third party. So I will give that up that they're probably not the optimal batteries, but these are so much better and it makes my quality of life for filming much, much better. And then the third big thing was this, the Flippy Screen. This is amazing. I'll take a video on here right now just to show you real quick. Alright, so this is the setup I have going on right now. I have my Sony a7 II on this tripod with this adapter because this doesn't have a full-size HDMI port going into my TV. This is how I would get the Flippy Screen here. This is a total pain to do, and this was completely unviable anywhere else as well. So the Flippy Screen, being able to do this to see myself, game changer. Last thing that I failed to mention is that this camera is actually just like falling apart a bit. This is just coming undone. I've tried to re-glue it a bunch of times. It just keeps on coming undone. It also just shuts off when it wants to in the cold, or sometimes it just yells at me. You'll hear the motor, the autofocus motor is going crazy. It's really just not in good shape. I mean, I've treated it well, but I think it's just getting a little bit old at this point. So it is what it is. There was a lot of reasons for me to buy this camera, and I'm so glad that I did. It's so much better. Now, to be fair, this thing is not perfect. I will admit that it is definitely larger than the Sony a7 II. It's quite a bit thicker. The handle is definitely significantly larger, and I don't think it's quite as comfortable to hold, especially because I have very tiny hands. But it is what it is, and that's a trade-off that I'm 100% willing to go with for the battery life, the Flippy Screen, everything that comes with this being a 100% better camera. And now I'll talk a little bit about the 24mm lens that I got here. So like I said, this is the Sony 24mm f2.8, and I like it a lot. Honestly, this is a little bit, I don't know if petty's the word, but a little bit superficial of me. This lens just looks better than the 35mm when it's on camera. I don't know why I care about that, but I do, okay? Yo, editing Kevin, step in here. It's because it clearly looks like a rangefinder, okay? Very simple. Now, what you might be wondering is why did I go back and forth between the 35mm and the 24mm? And the reason is that my focus is these kind of travel-oriented videos and photos, so I want something very compact. I have the 16-35, which fits both of those, but this lens is pretty big. So like I said, this lens is pretty large, whereas this one is much more compact. And I think that's a huge deal, especially when I'm trying to get all my gear into a single photo bag. So size was the main factor while I was going back and forth between the 35 and the 24. I also am biased towards primes. I really like primes. To me, they simplify photography and get me some extra sharp photos, which I really appreciate. And I think that's about it. I'm not one of those people that can pick out like what qualities a sort of lens has to it if it does something special to the image. It's really just about the focal length for me and the size of the lens itself. So while this one is a little bit bigger than the 35, the focal length is much more fitting to landscape style photos. And like I said earlier, you can vlog with it much better. I can see myself entirely here, which is much better than 35, which was kind of pushed in on my face, something like that. All this is to say that you will very rarely need to truly upgrade your camera, especially with all the improvements that cameras have made in the last couple decades. Editing Kevin back again. This is why I got a new camera. All I did was take the battery out, put a new one in, all the settings reset for some reason. I put them exactly to what they were before, and the video still looks entirely different. What? And while I entirely agree that you can make excellent work with subpar gear and subpar conditions, I don't see the point in not fixing a problem just to save money, especially if, like in my situation, I actually have the money to do it for once. And after using this setup for a bit over a month now, I can say that it has been 100% worth it. So thank you guys for listening to my little gear breakdown rant, And thank you so much for sticking around. I appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one real soon.